Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Arnav. I am a PhD student in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today. We're here with a fantastic panel, and we're going to be talking about sustainable finance and its connections to macro energy systems. Now, I want to thank a few folks that have really helped to make this possible. In particular, I want to thank Polly Yan at Stanford, who is hosting the webinar currently. I want to thank the MES steering committee and the community as a whole. Now, we here in the MES organization thought that we wanted to hear from some folks in the area of sustainable finance. Now, we know that macro energy systems is a field and research community that focuses on long-scale, systems-level, and long-term aspects of energy systems and their implications on other systems, including the environment, the economy, and human well-being. And we saw a lot of parallels between MES and sustainable finance. So we wanted to take a closer listen at what that field is all about. Now, luckily, we have three very distinguished speakers that have agreed to participate in this panel. And I'm going to start off with providing some quick bios of these speakers, who will in turn give their opening remarks. I'm then going to lead a Q&A session and open up the discussion to audience questions that you'll be able to enter directly through the Q&A feature in Zoom, and I'll be curating and answering these questions live. So I guess we're going to get started with our introductions. So first off, we have Jenny Chase. Jenny Chase is an analyst with BloombergNEF's Global Solar Insight Service. Jenny joined BNEF in the middle of 2005 and launched the Solar Insight Service in early 2006, running that team from Bloomberg's Zurich office until late 2022. She then stepped down from management, but continues to write about and analyze the solar industry as part of the team. Jenny actually published a book called Solar Power Finance Without the Jargon, which had its second edition come out in 2023, which is why we thought that she would be a great person to hear from today. Next up, we have Peter Fusaro. Peter is the founder of the Wall Street Green Summit, which is an annual event that's focused on the nexus of finance and technology, and now in its 23rd year. Peter was a professor at Columbia, creating and teaching a course on renewable energy project finance, and has lectured at other leading universities. He's a managing director and head of climate tech at Wield & Co., which is an investment banking firm advising and financing companies to provide solutions for decarbonization and the energy transition. Peter has written a total of 17 books on energy and the environment, including Energy and Environmental Project Finance, Law, and Taxation. And finally, we have Dr. David Victor. David is a professor and Peter Caughey Center on Global Transformation Chair in Innovation and Public Policy at the School of Global Policy and Strategy at UC San Diego. David is the co-director of the campus-wide Deep Decarbonization Initiative, which focuses on real-world strategies for bringing the world to nearly zero emissions of warming gases. Now, his research focuses on regulated industries and how regulation affects the operation of major energy markets. David was a convening lead author for the IPCC Working Group 3 report, Mitigation of Climate Change. So with that, I wanted to give our speakers a chance to make some opening remarks, and I'm going to kind of prompt it with a bit of an open-ended question, which is that you all graciously accepted our invitation to speak on the topic of sustainable finance to an audience that deals with macro energy systems. Now, my question is, how do you view sustainable finance, and why is it and being here to talk to us about it worth your time and attention? Now, I want to start with Jenny, and then we can go to Peter and David.
Thank you so much, Anna, but it's great to be here with such a distinguished panel. I admit when I got the invitation, the first thing I thought was, well, what is sustainable finance? You know, there's a taxonomy in Europe for something like that. There's a taxonomy in China that is something quite similar. And obviously the US has all kinds of ESG regulations that cover it. I suppose my definition would be more general than that. It would be that a sustainable that my particular interest is the energy transition. getting to net zero, burning less fossil fuels, setting up the system to stop burning fossil fuels. And so I would define it simply as something that accelerates or prepares for the energy transition. But there's also, from a financial perspective, sustainable finance is it's kind of a buzzword, but it's a way of accessing the immense pools of capital that has ethical limitations on what is done with it. So pension funds that can't invest in anything that's not in some way good, ethical. And so getting that kind of qualification to be sustainable finance does potentially lower your required rate of return. And that means that you can get projects done, which means that you can hopefully make money, stop burning fossil fuels, and maybe, although this is less my focus, and I don't think you can solve everything with every deal, maybe achieve other ethical or ecological goals. And it's important because we're kind of messing up the world and we have to stop.
Fair enough. That's a great response. Thank you, Jenny. Peter, what are your thoughts on this? How do you view sustainable finance and why are you here to talk about it?
Well, having just run an event with 45 speakers speaking about sustainability and sustainable finance, I'm very focused on the acceleration of capital to better technologies. We're talking about a long-term energy transition, which I'm actually reframing as the energy transformation. Energy, 73% of greenhouse gases. Energy decarbonization will probably be $100 trillion ticket in the next 30 years. So we're talking about a very long-dated, slow process of capital-intensive investment in technologies that make the world a better place. So I look at this from a lens of ESG. The SEC has just promulgated their final rule. They left out scope 3, but there's still a rule now on the books from the SEC on ESG. And I don't care that ESG is controversial. The point is I work on the E of ESG, which is the emissions. As I mentioned, energy is 73% of greenhouse. We need to move faster. So my focus has been on commercialization and scale. I've also been involved with early stage companies through Columbia Tech Ventures for many years. But right now, where we sit, and I totally agree with Jenny, we've got a crisis that we barely addressed. We need to make a transformation of how business really uses energy in a much more environmentally benign and sustainable way. And we have the technology and the capital is there. What is lacking, in my opinion, is the knowledge capital. There's a dearth of education. I've worked with Stanford and Oxford in the last 3 years. They just set up climate colleges. As you mentioned earlier, we need interdisciplinary approaches to how to change systems. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those are all good answers. Well, I accept the invitation because it came from a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon, which is an institution I care a lot about, and MES, which is an important institution. We have good collaboration with Carnegie Mellon on all kinds of projects. It's being hosted by Stanford, so why not say yes? So, I think it's really important to support institutions, especially when you don't know. Now let me turn to a few substantive points. We don't know what the outcome of this whole energy transition is going to be. I was at CERAWeek last week in Houston, where the Saudi, Aramco CEO kind of boldly said this is failing. He's wrong. We're applying the wrong metrics to success, but we're also going to use a lot of fossil fuels for a long time. But we don't know what the outcome is going to be. And so in that world, it's really important to support institutions and ideas and a diversity of experiences and so on. And the kinds of questions that MES is grappling with are among those. As for sustainable finance, I actually have no idea what sustainable finance is. I think it's like sustainable development or some other things that people have talked about where you know it when you see it. My guess is that sustainable finance right now is niche. ESG is a complete mess. And it's controversial as well, which is, I guess, helpful because it gives people something to do, to be upset about that. But it's incoherent. It's unworkable because there's just too much in the E and the S and the G, let alone all three together. And a lot of it was already in the markets anyway. So I think sustainable finance is a sideshow. I think finance is not a sideshow. What we need to do in the energy transition is deploy capital on projects that scale. And when we stop talking about sustainable finance and start talking about just finance, we'll see that. And indeed, that's what the market's doing. What BNEF's numbers are 1.8 trillion last year. Of that, 85% went into power lines or power infrastructure, solar and wind, batteries, and EV related stuff. So that's where adults with capital are deploying capital at massive scale, because the business models are most mature there. And they're not mature in a lot of other areas. And as all of it, everybody in the MES world knows, we're gonna have to work across the landscape, including on a bunch of stuff that's riskier. And that's where we're gonna need better financial models.
Great, thank you again. Yeah, these were some great responses. I felt like it's so clear to me that sustainable finance is something that everyone needs to figure out and wants to, but no one, like, it's so hard to figure it out, right? And it seems like, again, that's a very clear parallel between macro energy systems, where this is a group that we're trying to define this essentially, and understand, okay, how can we grab the existing work that exists and put it together into something that is cohesive and can be understood and discussed and shared with other communities. So now I want to turn to some more targeted questions for our individual panelists. Now, of course, if others feel so inclined, they can also chime in. But we're going to start off with you, Peter. So my question for you is, how do you see sustainable finance driving innovation and deployment of energy technologies at the scale you mentioned, which we also consider when studying macro energy systems? I guess we could start off with that.
Well, it's not one bucket. I mean, I'm looking at numerous opportunities: green data centers, grid resiliency, battery storage, both big and small, hydrogen, which I've been a big advocate of. I worked on the Prius with Toyota 27 years ago. So, and people are still using hybrids. The point is that we're looking at a beginning of a market, and we're looking at the beginning of two markets. We're looking at the beginning of a carbon market that's, despite all the hiccups, and the Guardian article is still growing. And we're looking at an opportunity to grow larger businesses for resiliency. Climate change is here, folks. It's been here for many years, but now it's very obvious. And one reason it is here is because media has paid attention to this. One thing you don't realize, Columbia University 4.5 years ago worked with 30 media organizations to message Climate Week, which we have in New York every September. That's why you hear all this noise about climate. And I think we need to now focus on the second half of this, which are the solutions to impending more disastrous impacts that are occurring already. And so my focus has been knowledge capital. There is a lack of knowledge capital in this sector. I've spent 25 years mentoring young people. I was a professor at Columbia teaching one of two courses on renewable energy project finance. The other course was at Yale. Now every school teaches renewables. We have a dearth of knowledge, and that impacts investors. If you can't make a good investment decision if you don't have good information. And I'm not going to go into the world of data and ESG and all the bad metrics we have out there. But the point is, there's a need for more people in this sector with bigger brains that can think long term, that realize there's no quick fix. You know, I go to Silicon Valley in the zeros and they talk about disruptive technologies. Well, there are no disruptive technologies. It's nonsense. The point is, this is a long dated situation, which is going to require the best and the brightest and smart capital that may be patient capital from family offices. Strategic investors have different metrics. They're looking 30, 40-year time horizons. I've worked for an oil company. I was head of consulting at ABB and OEM. So I kind of know what I'm talking about. And I've been a policymaker as well. So the point is, this is very long dated and there's no quick fix. So we need to think a little more systemically on how we're going to address risk. And in the financial markets, in my opinion, climate risk is now a financial risk. And I'll leave it at that.
Well said. Yeah, I did. I'm glad that you touched on risk a little bit at the end there, because when we talk about that sort of knowledge capital that you want to be able to deploy, and one thing that I see is that if you want to be making intelligent decisions, you need to understand the financial risks that are involved in these sort of deployments, especially in something which is evolving as rapidly as our macro energy systems are. Um, yeah, if you have more thoughts on how to effectively manage those risks, we'd love to hear it. But we can also open it up to the others. So yeah, moving on. I do have a question now for David. And this is about, related to your work on understanding regulations. So my question is, how does the landscape of regulatory frameworks and market mechanisms influence the investment decisions and financing strategies in the transition we're making to low carbon energy systems? And how can academic institutions, as you've alluded to, contribute to advancing knowledge and understanding of sustainable finance principles, and how they could collaborate to drive practical solutions, either with industry or with policymakers?
Well, that's a narrow, modest question. Let me offer a few reactions. First, I think the role of policy and the kinds of policies that work depend on at least two major factors. One of them is the state of technological development. So I was involved with some folks writing a background paper for what became COP26 on how to accelerate clean energy transitions. And it was, the theme of the paper was all about how what you do depends on where you are on the S-shaped curve. If you're in a sector where the technologies are mature and kind of people know enough about the risks that they can go off and deploy capital, and indeed call it sustainable, call it snuffleupagus, call it whatever you want to do, it's capital gets deployed. And people are evaluating risks. That's what's happening right now in light duty mobility to some degree, happening very much in the power sector. So the policy instruments there are really different. They're getting the externalities internalized and so on, letting the markets work. Maybe the carbon markets have a role here, maybe they don't. I don't know. I'm a little more skeptical about how the carbon markets are evolving, but that's a debate. But I guess that's what you do there. What you do in aviation or steel or chemicals is a science project. And so you have a different set of policies. There's no carbon tax big enough to be able to incent first of a kind projects that are capital intensive and very risky and so on. And we've run that experiment over and over again. We keep coming with the same result. So there you need different kinds of policy instruments. You need early stage investment. You need sometimes loan guarantees when you're building big demos, like all the usual stuff in the toolbox. You take out the shiny tool and you're pretty excited about it. So one dimension on which that answer varies is the dimension of where are we technologically in terms of the technological frontier, learning about the technologies and context and so on. The other dimension is the capabilities of the state. And I feel like we as kind of techie analysts focus too much on the first and not enough on the second. And now you have all these governments doing, in effect, industrial policy, and they may or may not be very good at it. I think the US government's probably better at it than at least the right wing thinks, but not as good at it as the left wing thinks, which probably means we're about right. It's not entirely clear to me that the EU is particularly good at coordinated industrial policy, but we can have a debate about that. But this whole issue about the capabilities of the state and when and how you can intervene in markets and the impact of that on the cost of capital and risk and so on are really, really important questions. They're kind of classic political science, political economy, institutional questions. So those are the two dimensions around which I think about the problem. And as all political scientists turn everything into a two-dimensional space, and then they fill in the boxes. So you can fill in the boxes, or anyone can fill in the boxes there. But last thing I'll say is, what does this mean for us in the MES world? I think some of these questions are amenable to systematic analysis in the models. And the way I would carry that into the models in particular has to do with the cost of capital. It's just, to me, continues to be stunning how little sophistication exists in most of the models about the actual cost of capital. And if everything that's interesting in the energy transition is capital intensive, which is the point I believe to be true, I think comes out of the models, and it's something we've talked about in the MES webinars in the past, then we need to really pay attention to the cost of capital.
Absolutely. Yeah, well said. Yeah, so yeah, I'd like to turn to Jenny now. So my question for you is based on things that you've said before and you've made remarks before, specifically about solar manufacturing. Now, you've said in the past that, quote, solar manufacturing is a viciously competitive industry. So I'm curious, how do you see this shaping the financing landscape for solar manufacturing?
Yeah, so I'm going to start by arguing with Peter. Peter says there's no such thing as disruptive technologies, and that's kind of not true. So my particular bugbear, solar, is just a wild example of a technology that has gone so far beyond where we expected it to be. I mean, solar panels today cost 3% of what they did in 2008. They are so super cheap. They're not quite so cheap in the US because you have all these trade barriers that keep out good modules. But they are super cheap, and that is really changing the way the world looks at these things. I mean, Germans are hanging them off their balcony with zip ties and then plugging them into the electrical socket because they're so cheap. And so that is pretty disruptive. However, what has driven this enormous cost reduction is a fiercely competitive industry where many, many smart people, many of them in China, have figured out how to grind every fraction of a cent out of the cost of making a module and every little bit of material out of it. And today's modules are super cheap and they're super expensive and they're super efficient and they're pretty amazing. But this does mean that if you built a factory 3 years ago with the best existing solar cell technology, it is now out of date and it's basically scrap. And that is horrible that is a horrible business to be in. I think at this point we should just be kind of glad that other people are willing to finance it. I'm not allowed to give investment recommendations, but solar manufacturing is a horrible business. A lot of places, personally, a lot of my clients are people with big pools of money who want to find a place to put that money where they won't lose it and they'll make their required return, and where they'll actually do some good. And I normally tell them to look at opportunities created by these cheap modules. So solar projects are much more economic than they used to be, even in places where the subsidy didn't used to drive it. And that also brings in things like batteries and smart EV charging. And basically, this is creating economic solar projects, which will create zero power prices in the daytime, because when the sun comes out, there will just be too much energy to meter, which will, in turn, that is also a risk for the solar projects themselves, because if everyone else has built solar projects and now power prices are basically nothing, then you are not going to make much money out of it. But that does create a very interesting macro energy system where understanding how all these things fit together and what actually happens to the energy prices and who wins in this scenario becomes the way of deciding where to put your money. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Arnav, but I think that's why macro energy systems are important to making solar finance investments.
No, I think that definitely answered my question. As you were talking, I did notice Peter was making some was showing some interest. I was wondering if you wanted to chime in.
No one's denying the bending of the cost curve for solar energy in the last 20 years. I still stand by my remarks that there's no disruptive technology for a $6 trillion global energy business. It's not that simple, and it takes a long time.
All right. Well, I'm glad to have heard these responses. I think it's great that there's, some debate going on. Jenny, if you wanted to say something, feel free.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's going on with solar is disruptive. I mean, last year, 440 gigawatts of solar were built. That was new build. Now, a lot of that was in China, but that's still a massive growth in places that are outside China. And I did wonder, listening to the remarks of the CEO of Saudi Aramco, if there's not a little bit of fear there. I'm certainly hoping there's a bit of fear there, because nearly 0.5 terawatt a year of solar panels is coming for parts of his business. And I mean, just for comparison, the world had about 8.5 terawatts of power capacity of all sorts at the end of 2022. So adding half a gigawatt a year of solar is not nothing. And so, yeah, I think that it definitely gives us hope that things can be disrupted.
Yeah.
Just comment on this. I mean, I'm not entirely sure. We may be having linguistic differences about the meaning of the word disruption, to paraphrase a certain US president, but I'm not sure that the Saudis are worried about the solar deployment. At least Nasser didn't seem to reveal a lot of tremble in his bones as he got up in front of that audience on Monday. To me, what's interesting here about the massive solar deployment is the solar story is increasingly not a story about the cost of building solar panels. The costs have plummeted in good locations. You can deploy them, like Lego blocks. It's increasingly a story, it's going to be increasingly a story about integration and reliability and so on. And there, to me, what's been most interesting to observe is how much the answers depend on grid configurations and so on. So it's partly technological, it's partly context. This is the idea in the study of technology that sometimes the challenge is pushing the technological frontier. Sometimes the challenge is understanding technologies in context, like how they operate on the grid. Chuck Sable and I, in our book, Fixing the Climate, talk a lot about this, because in what I'll call disruptive areas, but when there's huge technological changes, you often have both these kinds of unknowns, uncertainties. And the right answers or the best answers are unknowable until you really work with the technology. And so you have to run experiments and so on. So that we know from the history of technology and the ways technology gets studied. I guess I want to emphasize in all of this a role for MES, which is if the puck is headed, we're in the hockey season still, I guess we're in hockey season until July or something, but if the puck is headed in the direction of more concerns about reliability, we need to find ways of connecting the insights from power flow models to the insights of large energy systems models. And you can't do all that by just bringing in power flow models and modeling every hour of every year in the 2040s. That's not workable. But you can maybe bring in reduced form insights about the value of reliability, about which kinds of investments affect reliability. That would seem to me, along with this topic that I mentioned earlier about the cost of capital broadly, to be areas ripe for advance in the MES world, where advances in the modeling are real scientific advances, and they're also are real advances to understanding how the real world operates or could operate.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because there's so many different levels of insight that you can get into these different aspects of the energy system, whether it be the power flow, whether it be the the high level ecosystem that the electricity infrastructure is operating within. That actually does bring me to a question that I have, I guess, for all of you, is in your experience when you've been talking with folks that are, or when you've been doing work in sustainable finance, however it's defined, how do you see the level of detail of modeling that is actually used and useful, right? Because one question that we have, from my perspective as a modeler, is that it's so often that you can get caught up in the details of, okay, these are the inputs and the outputs, and then these are the mechanisms that we wish to model, but the complexity of the model has to match the requirements of the users. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got to say power project financiers are pretty basic, because all they want to have is a power price forecast, right? They need to know how much, if they keep generating solar power, how much will they get paid for it? That is pretty important, and basically nobody knows. So what they generally do is just buy the power price forecast from someone like Toby or McKinsey, and then they don't get into trouble because nobody ever got fired from using a third-party data source. And if the projects don't perform, most likely the people who made the investment decision will have moved jobs by then, so it doesn't matter. So financial decisions are not always made with the greatest sophistication, but they do have to be made.
Well, having taught financial modeling to policy students at Columbia, because I thought it was important they realize how things actually work in the real world. And we looked at all kinds of renewable technologies. But the exercise was that they at least had some financial chops. I brought in BNEF, I brought in investment bankers, and BNEF hired some of my students, which was very nice. But the point is, we're still looking at internal rates of return. We're still looking at ROI. We're still looking at depreciation schedule, all that kind of good stuff. Yeah, I would agree with Jenny. They do it. They make an investment. It's a bet. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose.
Money is way less important than I thought it was as a physics student.
Well, can I defend the importance of money for just a moment here? All these projects have to go through diligence. And so, and diligence might be flawed, just shocking, because we never see any flaws in institutions in life. And all the kinds of dynamics that Jenny's talking about, I think, are play in. Folks who are risk averse emphasize the familiar and the safe and the stuff that doesn't get them fired, so that if somebody's wrong, at least they're wrong in a group, and everyone loses a lot of money. So I think those dynamics are in place. But I think your question, Arnav, was a different question, which is, what's the role of the models that are familiar to the MES world in that? And I think the role to first order approximation is zero, because it doesn't tell us most of the things that are familiar to us in the academic MES world, large energy systems models and things like that, and so on. Even a lot of the power flow models don't have the granularity you need to do diligence on an individual project. And so the kinds of tools that Peter would have been teaching as students, basic project finance, we teach basic project finance, doing kind of straight up diligence, flawed or not, to Jenny's wise points. All of that is the real work of figuring out when and how capital gets deployed. And there are a few places that are now, BEV is a good example, which are thinking about deploying capital in different ways that are much more tolerant of risk and are very, very creative. And while they use the big models that are familiar to us in the MES world to kind of have a sense of the overall landscape, they're still making highly granular bets and guesses about what's going to happen with a cluster of hydrogen technologies, or what's going to happen with different routes to fusion. You know, should we be working on superconducting magnets, or should we be doing laser this or something that? And quite appropriately, that's not in our models. And in particular, the risk profiles around that are not in our models. So I don't think that's a good place for the models to try and be more influential. I don't think that'll ever work. But it is potentially a way to think. Maybe there are different ways of thinking about bringing in these financial diligence and risks for different stages of technological development into the MES world, to have a more sophisticated set of insights around when and how new technologies actually get backed and deployed, and how quickly do they come down learning curves. Maybe learning curve concepts the wrong way to think about it. Maybe there are other stochastic approaches. Like, all that seems ripe for developing algorithms that could be then brought into the MES models.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah. That actually did make me think of, in the line of understanding what is it that what is the salient information that is actually used in any given point of time. That made me think a little bit about, the information that is used in the sustainable finance, modeling that does exist, right? And when you're trying to understand that landscape, what information is available? And that makes me think of, the reporting standards or the transparency that exists in sustainable finance information. So could you each speak a little bit about, what does that landscape look like? What sort of information exists right now?
I'll jump in. I spoke at the CFA Society about 3.5 years ago about why there's no uniformity in standards. And the problem, very simply, is they all sell subscriptions. There's been a roll up in the data sets of I'm talking specifically about ESG now, but there's no standardization. People buy data to protect themselves, basically as a fig leaf, because they don't know. But we're in the beginning of that market. And I saw this happen in the energy markets 25 years ago, when the brokers tried to pull their data because they had some value to the data. So the data has value, but what's being reported? I mean, we'll see if there's any clarity with the SEC, and we're not going downstream to scope 3. So we'll just see what happens.
I guess, Jenny, why don't you go ahead and answer?
I was going to say that probably the critical question for a lot of power assets is a forecast of power prices. And the reason that's incredibly difficult to get is because it depends on so many things that you cannot model. I mean, nobody was, well, I don't think anyone fully had priced in the chances of Russia invading Ukraine in early 2022, which sent power prices soaring and meant that all kinds of people made more money than it had expected and other people made less. And that's the kind of thing that really moves the needle. On the other hand, there's also whether the technology works. I think that that's probably what we're quite good at, is understanding the status of the different technologies and what risk you're really taking. Because I mean, David mentioned some sort of venture capital stage things, and those are great, and most of them will fail, and that's okay because some of them will win. But at the same time, you can't believe what the founder says. And so some of it is about correctly assessing risk based on historical performance of similar companies.
Yeah, and certainly the last person usually was the founder. The founder has a napkin and a business plan on the back of the napkin, and they're raising money hand over fist, and they have every incentive in the world to lie about the potential of their technology because that drives valuations. I think you're exactly right. I think there's once again, there's a big difference between the early stage, risky, wacky doodle stuff and so on, where you've got all these different founders, everyone's disagreeing, but they all agree they want your money. And, who knows? And so, and that space, especially in this kind of emulsion between venture, early stage and kind of more patient deployment, that's still not a very rich space. There's not, to me, it's always just stunning how few players are really in there because the capital requirements are big and the risks are high and so on. Cassie Janaszek and I have a piece in Foreign Affairs from November making the argument that one of the fillers in that space is going to be long dated capital. So it's not going to be reckless with risk, but pension funds and so on, they have return requirements that are longer dated than a lot of the kind of classic public facing and bank based debt and so on. And so that could be very interesting, along with brown to green projects. So projects where you've got a whole bunch of technical expertise inside a company, a brown company, that then is going and doing something that's greener, but using those old skills. The oil and gas industry right now is trying to figure that out. I would say the regulated utilities have figured that out. And it's not an accident that we see the most progress in the climate problem and reducing emissions in the electric power, because the brown to green transition has been easier, whereas the rest of most other industries, it's much harder and so on. So I'm actually kind of encouraged that we're seeing this kind of some of this capital being unlocked, and that's a very big part of the overall story.
Yeah, I hear that.
Can I say one more thing about disclosure? I don't know if I'm going to go all the way into Peter's camp and say that this is a nefarious plot by the data companies to keep everyone, they're like crack dealers keeping everybody on the crack, and it's all privatized crack. And that's not quite what Peter said, but there's a lot of truth in that. I actually stunned if you subscribe to all these services, which I can't do as a public institution because I can't afford it. But I've seen, inside a lot of them, there's a lot of data out there. And I think one of the reasons we don't have clean standards on reporting is it's not yet clear what's material and not material, and what passes the standard of it being worthwhile to require at least a public-facing institutions to require rigorous reporting. And you see this in the controversy over the SEC standards, because you can imagine a long list of things to require, but it's costly, especially if people are going to, companies are going to really adhere to the standards, which once you make this a requirement, this is not messing around. You've got to adhere and you've got to comply. This is a compliance problem. And so the burden of reporting is really severe. And you see this in these multiple different groups, these different protocols about roadmaps and so on, most of which are just nuts. They're not connected to how real businesses operate. And so I actually don't mind not having too many standards right now because it's a little Wild Westy. And that's because we don't yet know what's really material and what everybody in the market needs to see at the same time.
Jenny, I'd like to hear your response. You definitely have something you could say.
I actually don't think I do at this time. I'm sorry, Arnav.
Okay, no, not a problem. Yeah, I mean, so I guess something that it did make me think of this entire conversation thus far, is, when you're talking about, where's the capital that's going to be deployed, it's these are new areas, there's a high risk. That makes me think of carbon markets. And it makes me think of it as an MES person who is looked at, the long-term forecasts of, what sectors are going to be involved in the energy transition or energy transformation. And the role of things like carbon capture is something that is there's so much uncertainty involved, and the numbers that you could see range so widely. And I'm curious as to, how do you see the finance sector viewing this, especially in light of the uncertainty that exists?
I think they view it with suspicion, as I understand it. I mean, carbon capture and storage is a very small sector. Not much has been done. Projects have been delayed. It's very expensive. And at the same time, it's also quite unpopular because using more energy to stuff the carbon dioxide underground just makes it more expensive. So it's not a nice idea. I don't think anyone likes it apart from maybe oil companies. However, when you do sit back and do systems modeling as to what pathways look like to get to net zero by, for example, 2050 while remaining below 2 degrees C, the model kind of, however much cheap solar you stuff in, and our model also stuffs in a lot of wind that is just not being built at the moment because there is not the grid to connect it. You look at all this and you do not get anywhere near 2 degrees. And so if you constrain the model to do so, it more or less has to build CCS. And so I guess that's what the financials and the governments are thinking about. Like, not so much, is this a good idea based on what's currently happening, but is it likely that future policy will drive this? And I think that's largely a result of large scale modeling. Hydrogen's kind of the same, by the way.
Let me just say, I completely agree. This is a big disconnect between us and the MES world and the real world, if I can say, that our models say you need to do CCS or hydrogen does not make CCS or hydrogen happen. Shocker, I know, to us that everybody doesn't line up. But we're starting to see both things happen in both spaces. I'd say hydrogen in the last year or so has gone through a rough patch. In CERAWeek this year, as hydrogen people were way down the end of the innovation agora, so almost in Louisiana, and not taken as seriously as they were a year ago. CCS is coming back, but there's a real bifurcation of business models. There are easy CCS projects, kind of high concentration CO2 streams, highly modular, access to the IRA credits, yada, yada, yada. And then you would have on-site or proximate infrastructure. Those are not trivial projects, but they're moving forward. The really transformative projects that come out of our models are the CCS projects involving power plants. And those projects still have a high death rate for all the reasons that Jenny just outlined. So when I look at this as an analyst, I say the world's not going to stop warming at 2 degrees, and it never was going to stop warming at 2 degrees. It was all Nasser called Aramco CEO called it I think a fantasy. The fantasy is 2 degrees. The fantasy is not that the energy transition is happening. And he artfully, I can imagine a variety of reasons for doing this. He artfully allowed people to be confused by the difference between the two.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I mean, so I guess at this point, I do want to take a step back and, let our attendees know that we are looking to take questions from you all. So please use the Q&A feature to submit questions, and we can go ahead and take a look at those. And
And
until
John has some, Arnav, John has a couple in the chat, but it's a different Q&A thing.
Oh, I see, I see. Yeah,
Yeah,
so
I'd rather go to the audience first. This is just to stir up the panel.
great, thank you. Yeah, so I guess as of right now, there are no questions in the Q&A, so please do feel free to submit. I guess we have John here, who is a professor at Stanford and is actually helping out with running the event. So John, if you'd like to ask your question, I see that it's about, the role of governments in greenhouse gas accounting. So I guess I'm gonna take this and build off of it a little bit and say, you know, we've heard a little bit from, I guess, David in particular about the role that, institutions can play, both academic as well as regulatory. But how do you see the role in terms of standardizing measurements, I guess? Is that what you were going for, John?
Yeah, that was my first point. We actually have a big group here at Stanford and running the Sustainable Finance Initiative, who has made I think I break this down into multiple parts. One is the traditional Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 accounting framework is probably worse than worthless, because if you really get into it, as David suggests, and look at individual projects on the ground, it leads to a massive potential for omitting various greenhouse gas emission flows and double counting. Moreover, if you really get into it, it creates a lot of free riding incentives that people have just started to recognize. Now, as in everything in this space, it isn't sufficient to just critique what somebody else has done as being lame or not very useful. So they have joined the couple of academics who have this framework known as e-liabilities, which is essentially you avoid the double counting by, it's kind of like a value-added tax. You get an inbound certificate from your suppliers and you send an outbound certificate with what you've added to what you have on the inbound out. Now, I actually changed what I said based on what David said, because I think that's god awful complicated to do. So, but in terms of government, I think government does have a role in setting the rules and the accounting standards, but it may be, and I think he actually put this out there first, basic principles for things that are really bad or things that seem consistent with a goal that might be hard to architect, to double digit precision. But I do think, it's the typical, what are valid rules for government? I think health and safety type things and these kinds of accounting standards in an area like this are extremely important. My view, I'll give you the more hard version of this, is if you don't have these kind of rules, you're going to have half the companies who are serious about doing something, and the other half, maybe similar to Saudi Aramco and Exxon at times, just interested in greenwashing or changing the subject to avoid having to do anything seriously. But I'm hopeful that you can have some basic rules of the game set up so there isn't, outright misleading alternative facts that get put into the hopper that look like they're actual facts, but they're really at best not very accurate, and at worst totally misleading.
Let me just comment briefly because I know time is tight. The one thing I'll say about the rules is, except in areas where it's very clear what a common standard should be, which is maybe some stuff around scope 1, and then after that, the clarity falls off quickly. And I don't know if this certificate program that you're talking about, that you're using as an illustration, I don't know if that's workable, because that seems like an accounting nightmare to me. But The one thing I've learned, having been very closely involved in the methane discussions, full disclosure, I'm on the advisory board of Project Canary, so we have a particular interest in one solution. One thing I've learned in this whole discussion is to be very careful about rules that become ceilings as opposed to floors. And so if you can create common floors to make sure that we have some clarity and we begin to create incentives for people to do better, then for heaven's sake, don't create a ceiling, because there's all this innovation that can come out in improving methods of accounting and accountability and things like that. And then to the corporate pledges, I think we're about to see a bloodbath in the corporate pledges world. And you saw this, what, 2 weeks ago with these folks getting voted off the island by SBTI. Now, SBTI was never a coherent concept of how the world operated, but you've got all of these companies that made these bold pledges that have no clue how to meet them. And at some point that music stops. And that, to me, I see that as a huge opportunity for other ideas to come in.
Totally agree with both points. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question, John. And so I guess we are starting to get some questions from the Q&A from the audience, which is great to see. I'm going to start off with one here, which is asking what aspects of long-term energy infrastructure planning and project finance are most relevant for policymaking? In other words, what indicators about model projections are most useful to inform feasible climate policies? Anyone can feel free to take a stab at that.
I suppose specifically on the power systems level, I think it's pretty important to understand what an electricity generation mix would look like in 2050. That is ideally zero, but at least very low carbon. I mean, a very simple one is in most seasonal climates, you've got to build wind as well as solar, because there's this really complicated modeling aspect that wind blows in the winter and the sun doesn't shine that much. But sort of understanding where you're going from can tell you things like you've got to build more grid. I mean, BloombergNEF estimates that we have to spend about as much on new grid every year to 2050 as we do on new solar and wind. And that's something that more or less does drop out of energy systems models. So yeah, just where you're going to and what a good mixture looks like, rather than just build the cheapest stuff, which is always solar now.
Yeah, and that really speaks to me personally as someone who has done research on, more of a multi-criteria approach towards understanding how we can best build out specifically energy infrastructure and electricity. I have a personal question for you all, which is, I do research in including other things, energy equity. And what we see is that, in many places there's been, historic imbalances in where finance goes, where investments are made. And so I'm curious to hear about how you feel that sustainable finance or finance in general can address energy challenges, energy access challenges in underserved or otherwise vulnerable communities and regions.
I'd love to answer this if nobody else can. So the problem with financing projects for poor people is that poor people don't have very much money, which means that lending them to them is a risk, and a risk will mean a higher cost of capital. Which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Development banks are absolutely committed to rolling out clean energy projects across the developing world to bring solar and wind and hydro and other energy sources to Africa, for example. It's often also very difficult because good projects are often quite small. It's not great if you have $1 trillion to spend and the individual projects are each $1 million, the individual good projects are each $1 million, because the fees of the cost of finding those projects, doing due diligence, understanding how they work, making sure they'll do good, become almost as much as the projects themselves. So this is really important, and it's obviously a huge sort of step we have to take to help places like Africa leapfrog over needing fossil fuel infrastructure. But it's also a lot more challenging than just finding the money for it.
Well, I'd like to add that in New York, we have quite a few initiatives on affordable housing and workforce retraining, because there's a need for people to get the benefits of more efficient energy systems. So that, a lot of that's retrofit, but also microgrids. So there's a lot of movement here on that.
You just add, maybe with Jenny and Peter's comments there, and Jenny talked about this a lot from a perspective of financing projects in other countries and dealing with the problem of undersupply of modern energy services. 100% agree. The other thing I think the MES world might want to spend more time on is how the politics of siting are changed. First of all, it's hard to build things. It's a news flash. And a lot of people believe, I'm not entirely sure we have the evidence for it yet, that if you do a lot of engagement and you really think and engage the communities, that it becomes easier to cite something. That's a proposition for which there's some evidence, but not overwhelming evidence, but it's probably true. And we also know that sometimes projects are hard to shut down because they hurt communities. Like, look at all these companies that are grappling with shutting down coal plants in Navajo territory. You shut the plant, everything disappears. Not everything, but it's a catastrophe for the community. So there must be ways to have reduced form representation of these political and institutional processes that could be brought in to our models that would help us understand under the real world conditions, how quickly can projects be built? What's the delta in cost? How many extra basis points is it, to think about it in crass terms, to do proper engagement? Is it a time question? Is it a money question? Does it change project configuration, efficiency? I don't know. I can proposition something like that would help connect the MES world to the real world of actually building stuff. And what we know about the energy transition is it's not going to come by you just walking around and thinking good thoughts. We're going to have to build stuff.
I think you're on mute, Arnav.
Or you've come unplugged.
Oh, yeah,
There you go.
thank you for that. Yeah. I really hear what you're saying, because one way that I'm thinking about this is that when folks are making investment decisions, they are working with, apologies, with real world constraints, and you need to be able to understand those constraints in your MES models as well. I guess there are a few more questions coming from the audience. I'm going to take a little bit of a look. Yeah, so I guess one question that I do see is, how do we consider the fact that most MES models maybe are not macro in terms of macroeconomics, and aren't really looking at the evolution of the economy in terms of finance, which is including things like money being created from banks or governments, and that sort of relationship with time and overall economic conditions.
Let me just comment briefly on that because I'm just mindful of the time here. Models need a purpose, and making the model into a Swiss Army knife is unhelpful. But the part of the macroeconomy that many of our models just are just unaware of is the cost of capital. So if there's one aspect of the macroeconomy that you were going to try to somehow bring in or stylize, it would be the cost of capital. So witness the bloodbath in capital intensive clean energy projects, especially the wind right now, because of cost of capital.
Great. Yeah, I guess, looking at the time, I'd want to round this out with, first of all, thank you all. And a last question is, how can we learn more? What resources are available? What should we be thinking about? How can we stay engaged? And feel free to share your thoughts on that. Otherwise, I want to thank everyone for taking part in this.
Can I just quickly say, one thing you could do is you could read, Jenny's company puts out this clean energy or sustainable energy finance, roughly the first quarter of every year, a look back. One thing you could do is go to one or two of those resources every single year and read it and see what people in the finance world are talking about. It'll just rattle you a little bit and it gets you to think about things that you could bring into your models.
I just also like to add, Lazard usually puts out the least cost of energy, LCOE, survey looking backward, but it's very well done as well.
Yeah, except for the problem is that the Lazard study is broadly disconnected from the real financial markets. Whereas Jenny's study, so I think I use the Lazard study as well, but I think the more granular we can get and how really understanding where capital's flowing and why, the better off we are.
Boo hiss Lazard, yes, read BloombergNEF. But
Wasn't quite
actually,
what I was saying, but yes.
it is a really great. I mean, there were actually a lot of people who talk about this in finance, and I would say that even if you're an engineer, do try and dabble in the financial side of it. You know, follow Peter, David, and Arnav on social media and see what they're talking about to find out what the finance community is talking about, because it usually isn't what the environmental community is thinking about, and they are generally closer to stuff actually getting built than the environmental community.
Great. I want to thank you all one last time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. And thank you all for joining, all of the attendees, and we hope to see you at the next MES event.
Okay, thank you.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you very much. Bye.